There are moments in history when a nation seems to hold its breath, when the ordinary rhythm of politics gives way to something darker, more volatile, and more dangerous. What happened in Dublin just minutes ago wasn't a protest. It wasn't a debate. It was an eruption. Streets that once echoed with music, culture, and conversation were suddenly drowned out by anger, intimidation, and chaos. At the centre of it all stood Nigel Farage, a man who has never been afraid to speak his mind, but whose words on Irish soil ignited something far bigger than himself. This was not just a clash of ideas. This was a warning flare, a chilling sign that Ireland stands at a crossroads between freedom and fear, between courage and silence. And in the middle of that storm, one thing became crystal clear. The crowd was not left debating. They were left speechless. Dublin, a city that has long prided itself on being the beating heart of Irish democracy, was shaken to its core as Nigel Farage took the stage. Known across Europe for his fiery rhetoric and his refusal to bend to political correctness, Farage came to Ireland not as a conqueror but as a speaker, prepared to voice concerns that many citizens have whispered in private but have been too afraid to declare in public. His message was simple yet explosive. Free speech is dying, and Ireland must decide whether it will protect it or allow it to be buried beneath intimidation and mob rule. But the moment his words rang out, the city streets erupted with fury. Protesters gathered not to listen, not to debate, but to shout down, to silence, and to threaten. What should have been a conversation about ideas descended into chaos, a symbol of how fragile democracy becomes when fear replaces dialogue. What stunned the world was not only the ferocity of the crowd, but the reaction, or lack of reaction, from those in power. When Farage was heckled, jeered, and nearly drowned out, one might have expected leaders, journalists, or cultural figures to step forward in defense of the principle at stake, that every voice, whether loved or despised, has the right to be heard. But instead, silence. A silence louder than the shouting mob. A silence that signalled to every Irish citizen that their leaders are willing to abandon them if their views don't fit the approved narrative. And in that silence, democracy itself seemed to tremble. Imagine being an ordinary parent walking those Dublin streets, witnessing the hysteria firsthand. You see a man standing alone, facing an angry mob, not because of crime or corruption, but because of words, because he dared to speak them. Imagine being a student, watching from afar, realising that if this is how public figures are treated, then what chance do you have to raise your own voice without being crushed by the weight of labels and intimidation? The chilling truth is that Farage may have been the target, but the real warning was for the people of Ireland. Speak out, and you too could be silenced. This wasn't just an isolated protest. It was the unravelling of something deeper, the cultural fabric that once defined Ireland as a nation of storytellers, thinkers, and fighters for justice. Instead of dialogue, there was rage. Instead of ideas, there was violence. Instead of courage, there was cowardice. And the world saw it live, unfiltered, a raw demonstration of what happens when politics turns into theatre, and the mob is handed the microphone. Dublin didn't just witness a disruption, Dublin witnessed democracy on trial. But the question that echoes in the aftermath is even more unsettling. Where was Ireland's leadership? Where were the defenders of liberty who claimed to represent the people? While Farage stood his ground in the face of hostility, Ireland's politicians cowered in silence, their refusal to condemn the chaos, sending a chilling message to the public. If the political elite won't stand for free speech, who will? If they will not protect one of the most fundamental rights of a free people, then what exactly are they protecting? The truth is harsh but unavoidable. In that moment, the people of Ireland were abandoned. This is what makes the Dublin eruption so much bigger than Farage. Because whether you agree with him or not, whether you love or despise his politics, the principle is universal. Free speech must be defended, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it offends. When we allow mobs to decide who gets to speak, we do not just silence one man. Cultural silence and media manipulation that has slowly conditioned the Irish people to accept intimidation as normal. When Nigel Farage spoke, he tapped into truths that many citizens feel in their bones but rarely dare to say aloud. That their voices no longer matter, that their government no longer listens, and that speaking the wrong words could cost them their reputation, their job, or even their safety. It is within this atmosphere of fear that the mob found its strength. For mobs thrive not in environments of courage, but in climates of silence. And in Dublin, silence was everywhere, except in the mouths of the angry few who shouted loudest. The tragedy of this moment lies not only in the threats hurled against Farage, but in the complete absence of any meaningful defence from Ireland's ruling class. When mobs gather and attempt to silence dissent through intimidation, true leaders rise to remind the nation of its values. They do not have to agree with the speaker, they simply have to defend the right to speak. Yet in Dublin, there were no strong voices from Leinster House, no rallying cries from media commentators, no words of reassurance from cultural figures. Instead, a wall of silence descended, confirming what many ordinary Irish citizens already suspected, that their leaders have surrendered the moral high ground in exchange for temporary political comfort. And when leaders abandon principle for comfort, the people are left unprotected. Consider what this says to every Irish parent raising children in today's Ireland. What do you tell your son or daughter when the lesson of the day is not courage, but cowardice? Do you tell them that truth matters only when it pleases the crowd? Do you explain that free speech is a right only for those who conform to fashionable ideology? The Dublin eruption sends a dangerous lesson to the next generation, that the mob decides, not the people, not the parliament, not the law. And if that becomes the accepted norm, then Ireland is no longer governed by democracy, but by intimidation. This is not an isolated problem. Across Europe and beyond, free speech is being eroded under the weight of cultural radicalism and political correctness. But what makes Dublin's chaos so significant is that Ireland, a nation that once fought with every breath for independence, is now surrendering its freedom without even a fight. The very same land that produced poets, revolutionaries, and thinkers willing to die for the right to speak truth, now allows citizens to be silenced by fear of being labelled, shamed, or threatened. This is not progress, it is regression, and it is happening at an alarming pace. And let us not forget the media's role in this decline. The eruption in Dublin should have been a wake-up call, a story about the fragility of free speech and the dangers of mob rule. But instead, much of the media chose to frame it as if Farage had invited the chaos, as though speaking unpopular truths somehow justifies violent intimidation. By doing so, they did not merely fail the public, they became accomplices in the silencing of a nation. Their selective coverage reassures the mob that their behaviour is acceptable, while at the same time signalling to ordinary citizens that their concerns will never be heard, only mocked. This is not journalism, it is betrayal, and its consequences are already tearing Ireland apart. But perhaps the most chilling part of all is not what was said, or even what was done, but what was left unsaid. The refusal of leaders to condemn violence speaks volumes. It tells ordinary people that their safety is secondary to political image. It tells victims of intimidation that they are on their own. And it tells the mob that there will be no consequences, no accountability, no restraint. In that silence, an unspoken contract was signed. The mob will rule, and the leaders will look the other way. That contract is the death warrant of democracy. Dublin's eruption is not just a headline, it is a warning. It warns us that Ireland's democracy is not invincible. It can be weakened, it can be corrupted, and it can be silenced. It warns us that when leaders fail to defend fundamental freedoms, those freedoms do not survive on their own. They require vigilance, courage, and sacrifice. And above all, it warns us that silence in the face of tyranny is not neutrality, it is complicity. Ireland is being forced to choose between silence and speech, between fear and freedom, and the events in Dublin suggest that the wrong choice is being made at the highest levels of power. In the end, what happened in Dublin was not simply about Nigel Farage. It was about every citizen who has ever questioned their government, every teacher who has bitten their tongue out of fear of losing their job, every parent who has wondered if their children will grow up in a nation that values truth or suppresses it. The eruption on those streets is a reflection of a deeper crisis. A nation that once prided itself on courage now risks being defined by silence. The chaos that engulfed Dublin in those tense minutes was more than a flashpoint. It was a glimpse into the future that Ireland is heading toward if nothing changes. The eruption on the streets revealed how fragile the balance has become between order and disorder, between debate and suppression, between freedom and fear. What unfolded was not just about Farage and his words. It was about a nation that now stands on a precipice. The images of a crowd silencing one man should haunt every Irish citizen, because in those chants and jeers was the sound of democracy breaking. And in the silence of Ireland's leadership was the sound of complicity. It is essential to understand why this moment matters so much. Ireland's story has always been one of resilience, of a people who refuse to bow down, who refuse to let others dictate their destiny. From the struggle for independence to the defence of cultural identity, the Irish spirit has been defined by defiance and courage. Yet today, in the streets of Dublin, that spirit seemed absent. Instead of a proud nation standing tall for its values, we saw fear masquerading as power. We saw mobs celebrated while courage was mocked, and we saw a government more concerned with preserving its polished image than defending the rights of its people. This is how nations lose their soul, not through invasion or occupation, but through surrender to their own silence. What makes this moment even more dangerous is the precedent it sets. If a public figure like Nigel Farage, who has spent decades facing down political storms, can be treated this way in Dublin with no defence from leadership, then what protection is left for the ordinary citizen? If the crowd can decide whose voice is allowed and whose is not, then every citizen is vulnerable. Today it is Farage. Tomorrow it could be a journalist, a teacher, a student, or a parent daring to ask uncomfortable questions. The eruption in Dublin was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a darker chapter in which fear governs speech and intimidation becomes law. The Irish political class must bear responsibility for this decline. For years, they have chosen the path of least resistance, bowing to the pressure of radical groups rather than standing firm for the principles they swore to uphold. They have appeased rather than led, retreated rather than fought, and in doing so, they have created a vacuum where the mob rules. Their obsession with political correctness and international approval has blinded them to the reality unfolding in their own neighbourhoods. While they polish their reputations on global stages, ordinary Irish citizens are left to face the rising tide of hostility at home. Dublin's eruption was not spontaneous. It was the product of years of weakness at the top. The silence of the Irish government during this crisis was deafening not only to those who witnessed the chaos, but to the millions of citizens who watched and waited for some sign of leadership. Instead, they saw leaders hiding behind the comfort of silence, too afraid to condemn violence because doing so might upset the narrative they have carefully crafted. This is not leadership. This is betrayal. A government that cannot defend its citizens' right to speak is a government that has already abandoned its duty. In moments like these, silence is not neutrality. It is an endorsement of intimidation. And when intimidation becomes acceptable, democracy dies not with force, but with neglect. Imagine being an ordinary Irish citizen that evening, watching the events unfold either in person or through a screen. You know instinctively that something profound has shifted. You feel the unease growing in your own community, where neighbours whisper instead of speak, where teachers hesitate before raising difficult subjects, where journalists censor themselves out of fear of being targeted. You see the same fear reflected in the eyes of your friends and colleagues. Dublin's eruption did not just happen in one square or one street. It happened in the minds of millions who realised that their country is no longer safe for truth. That realisation is the beginning of despair, and despair is the breeding ground for tyranny. What is perhaps most striking about this moment is the contrast between the bravery of one man standing his ground and the cowardice of an entire political establishment. Whatever one thinks of Farage, it cannot be denied that he faced the mob with words rather than retreat. He did not hide, he did not surrender, and in that courage lies a lesson that Ireland desperately needs to remember. Democracy survives only when citizens are willing to defend it, not when leaders run from it. The mob shouted, but Farage spoke. The government cowered, but he stood. In that contrast, the failure of Ireland's political class was exposed for the world to see. The eruption in Dublin is a symptom of something much deeper, a cultural sickness spreading through the veins of Ireland. It is the sickness of fear, the sickness of cowardice, and the sickness of betrayal. It is what happens when leaders elevate ideology over truth, when the media replaces journalism with propaganda, and when citizens are told that speaking out is dangerous. Left unchecked, this sickness will not only silence voices, but will dismantle the very foundation upon which Ireland was built. And once that foundation crumbles, it will not matter who speaks, because there will be no one left to listen. Ireland now faces a choice. The silence of its leaders has created a vacuum, but vacuums do not last. Either ordinary citizens will rise to reclaim their voice, or the mob will tighten its grip. Dublin's eruption was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a question that every Irish citizen must answer. Do we allow intimidation to define us, or do we reclaim the courage that once made this nation proud?